Hi and welcome again to Venezuela Insider. We are updating the channel, the content, due to the events that had happened recently. And we know that we haven't been doing so much content since you know, since everything that happened. Let's start, play by play by since the election that we had last year on July 28th. By the way, those were the last days that we have done content here on this channel. So since the recent events and a lot of information and disinformation, this is the most important thing, we are basically gonna do daily videos in order to keep up on what's going on, also what is true, what is false, and basically terrible analysis, terrible takes by many people abroad, non-Venezuelans that don't understand well the dynamics on the country. Now, if you have been a seasonal watcher of Venezuela Insider, you probably are ahead of the curve on that regard. But most people actually, and the most important thing, very prestigious people don't get the main ideas of the country, so they are just improvising and giving false analysis, very wrong analysis, terrible statements that are not true. So, well, first let's review what happened on the past year, and some change. Well, we had the election on July 28th. We did some coverage back then. The election were between, of course, the president Nicolás Maduro and the opposition candidate Edmundo González. We already know the story that the real candidate, the one that's supposed to be the opposition candidate, it was supposed to be Maria Corina Machado. That is the opposition leader. And by the way, this is the first take that you have to know. Maria Corina Machado is the only authority of the opposition. So when you hear on plural opposition leaders, that is the false statement. The only opposition leader is Maria Corina Machado. First point. Now we know that she was banned of running for election back then by the Venezuelan authorities. Remember that the Venezuelan government, Maduro's government, controls every authority. Therefore, basically they are employees of Maduro and they were not allowed. They didn't allow her to run. Okay, now thanks to a deal made by the United States back then of the Biden administration, with some easing of sanctions and oil licenses, I'm sorry, and so on. That's how that was the deal in order to let Maria Corina Machado run. And we got something called the Barbados Accord. That basically we're gonna ease the sanctions and things like that. We're gonna take it easy, give some concessions, release some prisoners close to Maduro, and the oil licenses in exchange for having a somehow free and fair election. But that didn't pan out exactly like that. So the end result was that Maria Corina Machado designated at the last minute this guy named Edmundo González Urrutia, and therefore he was going to be the opposition candidate, but basically it's just a front for Maria Corina Machado. Yeah, we had the election and the results were controversial. Here's why. Because first, the Maduro authorities said that Maduro won the election 51.2% against 44%. But the receipts of such election were never proven. Then, on the same night, Maria Corina Machado provided the real results. They are scanned on the internet, so you can check that out. And the results were that Edmundo González got 67% of the vote against 31% of the vote for Maduro. And this is taking into account that the abstention was close to 50%. Several, of course, the millions and millions of Venezuelans, most of them, not all, most of them, couldn't be able to vote. Sorry about that. So, the end result is that the Venezuelan authorities recognize Maduro's victory as the, president of Venezuela for a third term. However, the opposition showed the receipts that they indeed won. Edmundo González won the election, and that basically fractured the international community regarding on who to recognize. Edmundo González was recognized by, just a rule of thumb, Western countries like the US, the European Union, the right-leaning governments in Latin America, like for instance Argentina with Milei, or Paraguay that also have a right-leaning government, and Ecuador also right-leaning government. Again, and Maduro was recognized as the president of Venezuela by the left-leaning governments in Latin America, and usually countries like Cuba, countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico says that they don't recognize either, but de facto recognize Maduro. So, and those are left-leaning governments, and also countries in Asia, Africa, that, let's say, don't have a democratic tradition, let's put it like this, mildly, countries like Russia, China, Middle Eastern countries, and so on. Okay, and the fun fact in that regard, Serbia was the only European country, democratic European country that recognized Maduro. Just, fun fact. Yet again, that brought a lot of turmoil and instability on the country. We had a bunch of protests that week. Around roughly 30 people died on the protests, on the post-electoral crisis, as was defined, and around 2,000 people were arrested on draconian conditions. Now, like half of those were released a few months later, but still a handful of political prisoners have been, apprehended afterwards. Yeah, so we had all of that shenanigan for the first few months of this post-electoral crisis, and then we got the situation that Edmundo González, the quote-unquote opposition candidate slash president-elect of the opposition, he had to flee the country on September, like a month and a half after the election, and since then he has been exiled in Madrid, in Spain. Very good. Now, everything changed on the re-election of Donald Trump in early November of next year, almost a year from the day that we are recording, and since he took over, since his inauguration day. So, Trump, what he did, on his cabinet, he stacked his cabinet with a lot of Venezuelan hawks, including, of course, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that is probably the most hawkish politician outside of Venezuela against, the Chavismo and Maduro's government regime, as you want to call it. And Marco Rubio is actually a household name in Venezuelan politics because, of course, he's actually one of the promoters of the sanctions against several people of the government, of the Maduro's government, including Maduro himself. Okay, not only that, we got also Mike Waltz, the former National Security Advisor appointed by Trump, now UN ambassador, and that that position was filled also by Marco Rubio. Actually, there is a bunch of memes of Marco Rubio taking a bunch of jobs. So Marco Rubio is the first Secretary of State that also holds the National Security Advisor position since Kissinger. Yeah. Also, you have another people like the Deputy Secretary of State, Christopher Landau, that actually lived in Venezuela and knows very well Venezuelan politics. And I believe his thesis, when he became a lawyer, I believe he's a lawyer, was about Venezuelan politics back on the early 20th century. And also, Trump is surrounded by several Venezuelan hawks from Florida, like the Senator Rick Scott, the Congress representatives Maria Elvira Salazar, the Mario Diaz-Balart, and Carlos Jimenez. Both are Cuban Americans, and they are known in politics as the Crazy Cuban. And they have a very, very, very hawkish stance against Maduro. And of course, in Florida, you have a big diaspora of both Venezuelans and Cubans living in South Florida that they want Maduro out. Okay, that changed completely the game. Then on January 10, it was poised to be the inauguration day for the new presidential term in Venezuela. That Maduro took over without many questions. There were protests, and actually Maria Corina Machado was apprehended by authorities of Maduro, and Trump himself tweeted on his social media, Truth Social, how he was that please release her immediately or you are gonna see, the typical fuck around, find out. Okay, then when Trump took office on January 20th, the first thing that he did is he designated Tren de Aragua, or TDA, as a foreign terrorist organization. And we know that, and accused Maduro of being colluded with Tren de Aragua. Then, on the first few months of the Trump administration, it was some sort of understanding about, with Maduro. Trump appointed a special envoy. His name is Richard Grenell, that he's very well known on the MAGA crowd, the MAGA supporters. However, Grenell is not a Venezuelan hawk. Actually, he is according to his own actions and his own words, he is very pro-Maduro. He has the position that the United States should do business and understanding, have a good diplomatic relationship with Maduro. That is in contrast with the position led by Marco Rubio, that he wants Maduro out. So in the first few months of the Trump administration, the Grenell position was the predominant. Actually, he visited Venezuela and he met Maduro, shook his hand, and took a handful of the US prisoners in Venezuela that were kind of being used as a bargain chip. And also, he is a little bit the oil deals, just a little bit, but then he reversed course a few months later. Also, there was a deal about migration. Also, that was also very, very prominent on the first few months of the Trump administration regarding Venezuela. He wanted the migrants out, mostly the criminal migrants, especially the ones that allegedly are supposed to be Tren de Aragua. Some of them were deported back to Venezuela, and there are kind of like weekly flights, even today, from the United States to Venezuela, deportation flights. The alleged Tren de Aragua gang members were put on a prison in El Salvador, thanks to a deal that they made with Bukele, but then they were exchanged for the remaining US prisoners in custody in Venezuela. Now, afterwards, everything changed completely. Also, we have to mention that the United States, this is according to Marco Rubio, that back then was when he was appointed not only as Secretary of State but also as National Security Advisor. It was a black op, a secret operation, in order to extract Maria Corina Machado's close collaborators that were trapped in an embassy in Caracas. That was the Argentinian embassy that was kicked out, the diplomats of the embassy, and the embassy was custodied by Brazil. So these people, these collaborators of Machado, They were on draconian conditions. They didn't have water or food or something like that. But they were extracted after a year, roughly a year, by using secret elements of United States forces. I don't know exactly how it happened, but indeed happened, and it's called the Guacamaya operation. Guacamaya is a bird, typical national bird in Venezuela, beautiful bird, actually. Well, I'm sorry about that. So we're trying to, keep up. Then we come to the juicy stuff. On July, two events happened. First, it was designated as a terrorist organization, the Cartel de los Soles, or Cartel of the Suns. Allegedly, Maduro and his government have been, they are members, I mean, the top brass of the government, especially the military, they have allegedly a drug cartel, and they use state, Venezuelan state assets like PDVSA and things like that, and military and logistical things belonging to the government in order to, what a drug cartel does. So they were designated as a terrorist organization. And of course, we know that since 2020, Maduro and top collaborators like the Minister of Defense, they are designated as quote unquote narco terrorists, according to the United States. Back then, on the first Trump administration, and back then was Bill Barr, the Attorney General. He did the accusation, was very famous, and they put bounties. Now, the last days of the Biden administration, those bounties were raised. Around 12 people are on those bounties. And then, just on late July, early August of this year, now the present Attorney General, Pam Bondi, raised the, the bounty on Maduro to $50 million. That's historically, according to Bondi's words herself, that's the highest bounty established by the United States. And thanks to that, of course, in order to try to apprehend Maduro and bring him to the US justice. But not only that, that was just, kind of like the tip of the iceberg. Afterwards, and this is the most important thing that we're dealing right now, US military buildup has been going on in the Caribbean since the past over a couple of months. And we're gonna do a separate video talking about the assets, things like that. Remember, I'm not a military expert, I'm a civilian, economics and business and real estate and things like that. I'm not an expert on military affairs. And allegedly, these military assets that include destroyers, a small aircraft carrier, and now we're having a big aircraft carrier that we're going to explain that a little bit later. And also we have Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is relatively close to Venezuela, around 600 kilometers or so. And they are using Puerto Rico, the US Army, basically as a logistic hub in order to park military assets in the region, fighter jets, destroyers, Tomahawk missiles, also units, special, military units like the air hoppers, and things like that. I'm not an expert on military affairs. I had to be learning, developing quickly my learning curve on regarding, military assets and what they do and things like that. Okay. So on the past couple of months, first it was thought that was just, kind of like a smoke and mirrors in order to push for a quote-unquote regime change. The advertised reason from the Trump administration has been that it's an counter-narcotics operation. But remember, according to the Trump administration and the United States overall, Maduro and the people from this government have their own cartel. So they are quote unquote drug dealers. This is according to the, allegedly, according to the Trump administration authorities, but also the Biden administration as well. But you know what, they weren't that harsh, to put it mildly. But anyway, also since early September, we have been seeing strikes on open waters just outside of Venezuelan waters of boats that allegedly have they contain drugs and they are being shipped to the United States or maybe third countries and then going to the United States. Right now, we have over 10 of those strikes. They have been lethal strikes. Roughly a little bit over 30 people have been killed. And of course, you have pushback, mostly from the Democrats and Rand Paul. Also, I have to do a video why Rand Paul is mistaken about Venezuela. He also is. And why these actions are illegal. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. They are on a gray area, as far as I know. And over 30 of these people have been killed with military action. Now, the main question remains is that either Trump is pursuing counter-narcotics operation or is he pushing a regime change in Venezuela? And everything points out to the second option, that he wants a regime change in Venezuela, and he is using as an excuse the narcotics, operation. It's kind of like, when Colin Powell says weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, that's apparently the excuse. But apparently there are way more reasons for that that I'm not going to explain today, but are mostly geopolitical reasons. Could be the biggest thing is the presence, the good relationship that Maduro has with both Russia and China on the US backyard. And they are applying Monroe Doctrine, so I don't want to get on the geopolitical stuff because it's kind of complicated. By the way, most of the famous geopolitical analysts are completely mistaken about Venezuela. We have discussing Peter Sahan, that I like Peter, but the problem with his analysis, and I'm seeing this pattern, that he starts with great data and great information, but the conclusions are terrible. He's still on that pattern recently. Now, he did a great video reviewing the world powers resolutions and things like that. I think it's a great video on that regard. So on that regard, I'm going to give it. But there are people, for instance, like Jeffrey Sachs. He is completely mistaken, wrong. I mean, it's so wrong that he doesn't have any right thing that I can say, okay, he's right on this regard. Completely disregard Jeffrey Sachs, and there is a huge list. I have it here. Colonel Douglas McGregor. This is embarrassing because I believe he's a colonel, so he's an expert on military affairs, but his intel regarding military affairs within Venezuela is completely useless, and that's embarrassing coming from a colonel. You have Nick Fuentes, the controversial Nick Fuentes. Like 80-90% of what he is analyzing about Venezuela is completely wrong. Please disregard him. Also, you have the people from the Young Turks, Schenk and Ana Kasparian, completely mistaken about Venezuela as well. Now, I like the Young Turks, by the way. I watch it occasionally. And one of the guys on the Young Turks, John J, I don't remember his name, the good-looking guy. And he said, dude, I don't know anything about Venezuela, so I'm not going to lie. So, good call, John or Jay, I don't remember your name. And well, things of that. Also, you have these neocon war expert channels that have doing a great job doing the analysis on the equipment and on the Ticonderoga class vessels that I still haven't figured out what is a Ticonderoga class destroyer, but yeah, looks dangerous. That's not the only thing I'm gonna say. But regarding the analysis on Venezuela is terrible. I'm seeing channels like The Enforcer, also remember David, I forgot, David Hookstead, I believe his name. Great content also as well, but he needs, he's on both of these guys, Enforcer and Hookstead, are on a learning curve about Venezuela, so they're getting there, of course. They are not an expert on that. just as I'm not an expert on military assets and things like that, so I'm learning. They are learning about Venezuela. Still, also you have Preston Stewart, that I believe he's way behind the curve, but I believe he's sincere. However, he's wrong on a lot of aspects on Venezuela, but I think he's intellectually curious, so I think he's getting there, but he's way far. But still, shout out to Preston for trying to do the homework. Okay, uh, going back again, after the military vessels, the strikes, the military strikes on these alleged drug vessels, what I'm seeing right now, we are seeing all right now is back and forth on declarations and political statements and things like that we are going back and forth. But apparently, Trump is actually committed to a regime change in Venezuela. Now, other thing, by the way, for every people that is wrong about Venezuela, the first way in order to detect if someone is wrong about Venezuela, they're gonna compare it with Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Syria, Yemen, places like that. Please, everyone, every time, if you're watching this, do yourself a favor. Every time they mention Venezuela in these countries, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, places like that, Vietnam, please disregard. They are completely wrong about Venezuela. They understand they are, flat out, they flunked the course. So please disregard them. They are either completely mistaken, completely wrong, or they are lying in order to fulfill a political agenda, their political bias. By the way, this channel, remember, this is not about what we want, it's about what it is. And I like to keep things pragmatic outside of my political bias. So I'm reporting on what is going on realistically. These people, for instance, I see people that are Trump supporters that they don't want a war with Maduro. And that's perfectly understandable. However, you cannot manufacture lies in order to prevent it. Because first, you're not going to do anything. I mean, these particular content creators are not going to influence Trump's decision making. He's going to do it regardless of your opinion. So the best thing you can do is keep your reputation and at least do a coherent analysis, something that I'm not seeing very well. Okay, now in order to put some more recent news, the Wall Street Journal mentioned that land strikes are coming. The Wall Street the Journal is, bullseye on what on the reporting about Venezuela. I will put on a lesser degree the Financial Times, and the New York Times are hit and miss on that situation. But apparently, according to the journal, there are going to be land attacks on Venezuela, and this is just recently, just fresh out of the print. And they're not going to attack only drug-related facilities, but also military facilities and state-related facilities. Remember, according to the Trump administration, the Venezuelan government runs a drug cartel and cartel of the Suns, and that's how they are basing their decision making. So it is what it is. In other news, also we have to mention that Venezuela just won their second Nobel Prize in history, and this time, of course, with the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, that she was appointed as the Nobel Peace Prize winner. So, shout out to Machado. I'm happy when a Venezuelan wins an award, regardless of their political bias, and it was impressive. So, congratulations to her. Also, there was this saying that Trump is going to be upset. Maria Corina Machado actually said that the real winner were first the Venezuelan people and Donald Trump. So she dedicated the prize to Donald Trump. So what we're gonna do on the next few days, we're gonna do daily videos, with the news in order to, this is a moving target, a lot of things going on right now, and also a lot of disinformation. Also, updates on the channel, we have to do updates on everything that I say. The older videos, I sustain everything that I say, however, needs updates regarding safety, regarding the real estate, Regarding dating, I'm still thinking about the dating videos, if they're gonna be done or not. We are in a delicate situation. And yeah, remember, right now it's a crapshoot what is going on. So please keep in touch and have a nice day.